The guard's boots were close enough that Roger Bushell could hear the leather creak against the frozen ground. He was buried 3 feet below the surface of a Polish forest, his face pressed into soil that smelled of pine needles and decay, breathing through a gap no wider than a pencil between 2 rotting logs. The February cold had turned the earth into something resembling concrete, and every shallow breath he took felt like it might be his last before the air ran out completely. Above him, German voices called out to one another with the casual confidence of men who believed they had already won. They were searching for him, had been searching for 3 days now, and Roger Bushell lay perfectly still in his makeshift grave, counting the seconds between each footfall, calculating whether the mathematics of survival would allow him to see another sunrise. This was not the first time he had hidden from his captors. It would not be the last. But what the guards walking above him did not yet understand was that the man buried beneath their feet was not simply another escaped prisoner trying to reach safety. He was something far more dangerous than that. He was a man who had transformed failure into expertise, who had studied the architecture of captivity with the intensity of a scholar, and who was already planning an escape so audacious that it would require 3 tunnels, 200 men, and a willingness to risk everything for a chance at freedom that statistics suggested would never come. Roger Bushell had not set out to become a legend of defiance. Before the war turned him into something harder and more desperate, he had been a man of considerable charm and privilege, a barrister who moved through London society with the ease of someone born into comfort. He spoke German fluently, had spent time in the country before hostilities began, and possessed the kind of sharp, strategic mind that could dismantle an opponent's argument in a courtroom with surgical precision. When war broke out, he joined the Royal Air Force not out of patriotic fury but with the measured determination of a man who understood that the world was changing and that neutrality was no longer an option for anyone. He became a fighter pilot, and for a brief period in those early chaotic months of conflict, he experienced the strange exhilaration of aerial combat. The way the sky could transform from empty blue expanse into a geometry of death in the span of a heartbeat. Then his Spitfire was hit during the retreat to Dunkirk in May of 1940, and everything that had defined his life before dissolved into smoke and confusion as his aircraft spiraled toward occupied France. The crash should have killed him. The fact that it did not felt less like luck and more like the universe setting him on a path he had not chosen but would be forced to walk for years. He crawled from the wreckage with injuries that made every movement an exercise in controlled agony, and within hours French civilians had found him and hidden him in a farmhouse where the smell of animals and hay became indistinguishable from the scent of fear. For weeks he moved through the French countryside, passed from one safe house to another by people whose courage he could barely comprehend, ordinary farmers and shopkeepers who risked execution to help a foreign pilot they had never met. He came within miles of the Spanish border, close enough that he could almost taste the freedom that waited on the other side of the Pyrenees. And then the luck that had sustained him ran out in the way it always eventually does. German soldiers stopped the truck he was hiding in, and Roger Bushell became a prisoner of war. The first camp they sent him to was Stalag Luft, a transit facility where newly captured airmen were processed and interrogated before being shipped to permanent compounds. It was here that Bushell encountered the machinery of German efficiency, the way the Third Reich had systematized even captivity, turning it into something clinical and precise. The interrogators who questioned him were not the sadistic brutes of propaganda films, but educated men who spoke perfect English and who understood that information could be extracted through patience and psychology as effectively as through violence. They wanted to know about RAF tactics, about squadron strengths and operational capabilities, and Bushell gave them nothing, responding to every question with only his name, rank, and service number as the Geneva Conventions required. What he learned during those weeks of interrogation was more valuable than anything he revealed. He learned that the German military mind, for all its vaunted precision, operated according to patterns that could be studied and predicted. He learned that rules, even in a prison camp, created gaps that could be exploited. And he learned that escape was not simply about getting beyond the wire but about understanding the systems that held you in place. His first escape attempt came within months of his capture. He simply walked out of the camp during a moment of confusion when guards were distracted, slipped into the German countryside, and disappeared. For 5 days he moved cross-country, navigating by stars and instinct, avoiding roads and populated areas, living on whatever he could scavenge or steal. He was recaptured trying to board a train, turned in by a suspicious conductor who noticed the wrong cut of his civilian clothes, the way he held himself that marked him as foreign despite his fluent German. They brought him back to the camp and put him in solitary confinement, a concrete cell barely large enough to stand in where the silence became a physical presence that pressed against his skull. Most men would have learned caution from such an experience. Bushell learned only that his next attempt needed better planning. The second escape came from a different camp after he had been transferred, and this time he made it further, nearly to Switzerland before being caught. The third attempt ended in recapture after 48 hours. The fourth lasted less than a day. With each failure, the Gestapo's interest in him intensified. They began to keep a special file on this British officer who refused to accept his captivity, who treated imprisonment as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. There were threats, warnings that continued escape attempts would result in consequences more severe than solitary confinement. But Bushell had already crossed some internal threshold where such threats had lost their power to deter him. He had discovered something about himself in those repeated attempts to break free, something that might have disturbed him if he had examined it too closely. The escapes had become more important than freedom itself. They had become a way of maintaining his identity in a place designed to strip identity away. A way of proving to himself and to his captors that he had not been broken by capture. By the time he arrived at Stalag Luft III in the spring of 1942, Roger Bushell had attempted to escape from German custody more times than almost any other prisoner in the system. The camp sat in the middle of a pine forest about 100 miles southeast of Berlin, deliberately positioned far from any neutral border, surrounded by sandy soil that collapsed easily and made tunneling treacherous. The Germans had designed it specifically to hold captured Allied airmen, and they had learned from the escape attempts at other facilities. The barracks were elevated off the ground on stilts to prevent tunneling beneath them. Seismograph microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect underground digging. The guards who staffed the watchtowers had been selected for their vigilance, and were rotated frequently to prevent complacency. The camp commandant, Friedrich von Lindener, was a Luftwaffe officer of the old school who believed in running his facility according to proper military protocol, which meant treating prisoners with a certain cold professionalism but also maintaining security with Germanic thoroughness. It was, by the standards of prisoner-of-war camps, considered escape-proof. Bushell studied Stalag Luft III with the intensity of an architect examining a structure he intended to demolish. He walked the perimeter during exercise periods, noting the spacing of the guard towers and the sight lines they commanded. He observed the routines of the guards, the times when shifts changed and attention might waver. He counted the steps from the barracks to the warning wire that marked the boundary beyond which prisoners could be shot without warning, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a surveyor. And he began to assemble around him a group of men who shared his refusal to accept captivity as a final verdict. These were not reckless adventurers seeking glory but patient, skilled individuals who understood that a successful escape from a place like Stalag Luft III would require engineering, forgery, tailoring, intelligence gathering, and coordination on a scale that had never been attempted before in a German prison camp. What emerged from those early discussions was not a plan for one man to slip through the wire but a vision of mass escape, an operation so ambitious that it bordered on madness. Bushell proposed digging not one tunnel but three, simultaneously, under different barracks, to divide German attention and ensure that even if one or two were discovered, the third might survive to completion. Each tunnel would need to extend more than 300 feet to reach the forest beyond the camp's cleared perimeter, driven through sandy soil at a depth of 30 feet to avoid the seismograph detectors. They would need to construct an underground railway to move dirt efficiently, design an air circulation system to keep diggers from suffocating, build supporting frames to prevent cave-ins, manufacture civilian clothing for 70 or 80 escapers, forge identity papers and travel documents that could withstand scrutiny, and create an intelligence network inside the camp to monitor German activities and provide warning of searches. The scope of what Bushell was suggesting went far beyond escape. It was an engineering project, an intelligence operation, and an act of organized resistance rolled into one impossibly complex endeavor. The men who joined what came to be called the Escape Committee brought skills acquired in their previous lives. There were mining engineers who understood soil mechanics and could calculate the mathematics of tunnel stability. There were artists and forgers who could reproduce German documents with such precision that the forgeries were indistinguishable from originals. There were tailors who could transform rough blankets into convincing civilian suits, and craftsmen who could fashion tools from scavenged metal. There were intelligence officers who could cultivate relationships with guards, exploiting small corruptions and sympathies to obtain materials or information. What Bushell created was not simply an escape organization but a shadow economy within the camp, a network of production and exchange that operated beneath the surface of daily prison routine. Men who had been fighter pilots and bomber crews became diggers and forgers and tailors, their previous identities subsumed into the roles required by the plan. The tunnels were given names with dark humor: Tom, Dick, and Harry, as if they were companions in some adventure rather than holes carved through earth by men working in near-total darkness with improvised tools. The digging itself was an exercise in controlled claustrophobia. The tunnel shafts were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, the air thick with dust and the constant threat of collapse. Diggers worked in shifts, lying on their stomachs in the darkness, scraping away sand with tools fashioned from tin cans and bed slats, breathing air pumped down from above through pipes made from powdered milk tins soldered together with improvised solder. The sand they removed had to be dispersed throughout the camp in ways that would not attract attention, and so another group of prisoners took on the role of penguins, walking the grounds with bags of sand hidden beneath their trousers, releasing it gradually through holes in the pockets so that it mixed with the surface soil. Hundreds of pounds of sand disappeared this way, spread across the camp in quantities too small to be noticed individually but which collectively represented the excavation of 3 tunnels driving steadily toward freedom beneath the guards' feet. Bushell coordinated it all from above, moving between barracks with the calm authority of a general managing a campaign. He delegated responsibilities but maintained control over strategic decisions, and he enforced a discipline within the escape organization that was stricter than anything the Germans imposed. Security was absolute. Information was compartmentalized so that no single prisoner knew the complete picture except Bushell himself. When Tunnel Dick was discovered during a routine search, the setback was absorbed without panic because Tom and Harry remained intact, and the work continued with barely a pause. The Germans believed they had dealt a significant blow to escape preparations. They had no idea that the discovery was almost irrelevant to the larger plan still unfolding beneath their feet. As the months stretched into a year and then longer, the psychological weight of the project began to extract its toll. Men worked in darkness knowing that every shovel of sand might trigger a collapse that would bury them alive. Forgers went nearly blind creating documents under poor light, reproducing German Gothic script letter by letter until their hands cramped. The tailors stitched civilian clothes with thread pulled from prison uniforms, garments that would need to pass inspection by German police and Gestapo agents if the wearers were to have any chance of reaching safety. And above it all hung the knowledge that even if the tunnel reached the forest, even if 70 or 80 men made it outside the wire, the odds of any of them actually reaching neutral territory were vanishingly small. Germany was a police state in the middle of total war, every station and checkpoint monitored, every stranger subject to scrutiny. The men knew this, discussed it in quiet conversations after lights out, and kept working anyway because the alternative was to accept that captivity had defeated them. Bushell himself had changed during the long months of planning. The charm that had defined him before the war had been refined into something harder, a charisma built on absolute certainty of purpose. He no longer spoke about escape as an attempt but as an inevitability, and his conviction became infectious. Men who had doubted the plan found themselves drawn into it not by argument but by the force of Bushell's will, by his refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure even as setbacks occurred. When Tunnel Tom was discovered in the autumn of 1943, the loss could have broken the organization's morale, but Bushell absorbed the blow and redirected energy toward Harry, the remaining tunnel, with such seamless efficiency that the work never stopped. He had become what the plan required him to be, not a man pursuing freedom, but an idea made flesh, the embodiment of resistance to captivity. By the winter of 1944, Tunnel Harry had reached completion. 335 feet of carefully shored tunnel stretched from beneath Barracks 104 into the forest beyond the camp perimeter. The forgery department had produced dozens of sets of identity documents, travel permits, and authorization papers. The tailoring shop had created civilian suits, overcoats, and hats that could transform RAF officers into plausible German businessmen or foreign workers. An intelligence network had compiled information on train schedules, border crossing points, and safe house contacts in the outside world. The escape committee had drawn up lists determining who would go and in what order, with spaces allocated based on a combination of language skills, contribution to the tunnel work, and likelihood of reaching safety. Bushell placed himself near the front of the list, not out of privilege, but because he believed his experience and German language ability gave him the best chance of making it to neutral territory, and a successful escape would validate everything the plan represented. The date was set for March 24th. The night was moonless, visibility poor, conditions as favorable as they were likely to get. As darkness fell over Stalag Luft III, 76 men gathered in Barracks 104, dressed in their civilian disguises, carrying forged papers and whatever small supplies they had been able to assemble. The atmosphere was electric with tension and suppressed excitement, the knowledge that after more than a year of preparation, the moment had finally arrived. Bushell moved among them with quiet confidence, offering last instructions and encouragement, and then he descended into the tunnel entrance for what would be the final time. The plan called for men to move through the tunnel at intervals, emerging in the forest and dispersing quickly before the guards noticed anything wrong. But almost immediately, things began to go wrong in small ways that accumulated into larger problems. The tunnel exit, when it was finally broken through to the surface, emerged 10 feet short of the tree line, opening in clear view of a guard tower. The cold had frozen the tunnel's wooden supports, making them creak and shift dangerously. Men moving through the tunnel became stuck, causing delays that cascaded backward through the line of waiting escapers. What should have taken minutes stretched into hours, and as the night wore on, the number of men who had made it out remained far below what had been hoped for. Bushell went early, emerging into the March cold and moving quickly into the forest before the guards could register what they were seeing. He made his way to the Sagan railway station and boarded a train toward the French border, traveling with forged papers that identified him as a French worker returning home. For 3 days he moved through Germany, changing trains, passing through checkpoints, getting closer to freedom with each mile. Other escapers scattered in different directions, some heading for Czechoslovakia, others for Switzerland or Denmark, each following routes planned months in advance. And behind them, the German military and police apparatus mobilized with terrifying efficiency. The escape was discovered shortly before dawn on March 25th when a guard noticed movement near the tunnel exit. The alarm went out across Germany, and what followed was the largest manhunt in the history of the Third Reich. Thousands of soldiers, police, and Gestapo agents were diverted from war duties to search for the escaped prisoners. Roadblocks appeared on every highway. Railway stations were flooded with security personnel. The fury of the response went beyond simple security concerns. Hitler himself became involved, reportedly enraged that British prisoners had humiliated German military security on such a scale. He demanded that the recaptured escapers be executed as a lesson, and though his subordinates negotiated him down from killing all of them, the compromise was still monstrous. 50 of the recaptured prisoners would be shot. Roger Bushell made it to within a few miles of the French border before being caught. He was traveling with a French prisoner named Bernard Scheidhauer, and they were detained at a checkpoint where their papers, despite the forger's skill, raised suspicion under close examination. The Gestapo took them into custody, and what happened next remains clouded in the official version, but clear enough in its essentials. They were driven to a remote location along a country road and told to step out of the vehicle. Then they were shot in the back and their bodies left in a ditch. The Gestapo report claimed they were shot while trying to escape. The standard fiction used to cover murder, but the evidence told a different story, one of execution carried out in cold blood on orders from the highest levels of German command. 49 others died the same way over the following days and weeks. Men who had survived the tunnel and the escape were recaptured and then murdered, shot in small groups or individually. Their bodies returned to Stalag Luft III in urns or not at all. The Germans framed it as lawful execution of saboteurs and spies, but the truth was darker and simpler. It was revenge for embarrassment, a message written in blood to discourage future escape attempts. Only 3 of the 76 escapers made it to freedom, reaching neutral territory through luck and skill in roughly equal measure. The rest were either murdered or returned to captivity to face the knowledge that their friends had been killed for doing exactly what military duty and honor had demanded they do. The murders became known as the Stalag Luft III massacre, and after the war they were prosecuted as war crimes. Those Gestapo and SS officers who could be identified and captured faced trial and execution, a measure of justice that came too late for the 50 men who had been killed. Roger Bushell was buried in a German cemetery, and later his body was returned to England where he was laid to rest with military honors. The tributes spoke of his courage and his refusal to surrender to captivity, but they could not alter the mathematics of what had occurred. 76 men had escaped through a tunnel that represented more than a year of dangerous labor. 3 reached freedom. 50 were murdered. The remaining 23 returned to prison camps where they would remain until the war ended. And yet the Great Escape, as it came to be known, was not simply a failure measured in lives lost. It had forced the Germans to divert massive resources to recapture prisoners at a time when those resources were desperately needed elsewhere. It had demonstrated that even in the most secure facilities, under constant surveillance and threat, Allied prisoners would continue to resist their captivity. And it had created a legend that would outlive everyone involved, a story of defiance that subsequent generations would tell and retell until the details blurred into myth. Roger Bushell became the Tunnel King, the man who refused to accept defeat, whose 17 escape attempts made him a symbol of resistance. The fact that most of those attempts ended in recapture, that his final escape ended in murder, did not diminish the power of what he represented. If anything, the tragedy made this story more resonant, more human. There is a kind of mathematics to heroism that does not account for success or failure in conventional terms. Bushell and the men who dug those tunnels knew the odds were against them, knew that escape from the heart of Germany in the middle of total war was statistically almost impossible. They proceeded anyway, not out of delusion but out of a refusal to let mathematics define what was possible, or what was worth attempting. The tunnel that took a year to dig gave most of its users only a few hours or days of freedom before recapture. But those hours mattered because they represented a rejection of the logic of captivity, a demonstration that even when every rational calculation suggested surrender, the human will could choose otherwise. The 76 men who crawled through Tunnel Harry into the March darkness were not escaping toward certainty of freedom, but toward the possibility of it. And that possibility alone was enough to justify the risk. They knew they might fail. They knew they might die. What they could not accept was living as prisoners without trying to be something else. And so they tried, and most of them died for it, and the world remembered them not as failures but as examples of what courage looks like when stripped of any expectation of reward. Roger Bushell spent 4 years in German captivity, attempting escape after escape, each failure teaching him something new about the systems that held him, each recapture hardening his resolve. He could have stopped after the 10th attempt or the 15th, could have accepted that the war would end eventually and that survival, until that end, was the rational goal. Instead, he organized the most ambitious escape attempt of the war, knowing it would likely fail, knowing the consequences might be catastrophic. He made that choice with open eyes, and when the Gestapo shot him on a country road in March of 1944, they killed a man who had never allowed them to claim victory over his will. The tunnel remained behind him, a scar through the earth beneath Stalag Luft III, evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, the impulse toward freedom cannot be completely suppressed. In the decades since, historians have analyzed the Great Escape from every angle, debating whether the cost was justified, whether the resources devoted to it might have been better spent elsewhere, whether the predictable response should have deterred the attempt entirely. These are reasonable questions that miss something essential about why the escape mattered then, and why it continues to matter now. The men who dug those tunnels were not conducting a cost-benefit analysis. They were asserting their humanity against a system designed to reduce them to numbers, and they succeeded in that assertion even when the escape itself failed. The tunnel was never just about getting out. It was about refusing to accept that getting out was impossible, about maintaining identity and purpose in a place built to strip both away. Roger Bushell lies in a quiet cemetery in England, his grave marked with a simple stone that records his rank and the date of his death. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the story they know from films or books, and they stand for a moment in silence before moving on. The tunnel collapsed long ago, filled in by the Germans after the escape, or simply claimed by time and the shifting earth. The camp itself was torn down after the war, the barracks burned, the wire removed, the guard towers dismantled. Only a small memorial remains to mark where thousands of men lived and suffered and planned their impossible escape. But the story persists because it speaks to something that does not collapse or fade, the knowledge that some prisons exist to be escaped from regardless of the odds, and that the men who attempt such escapes are worth remembering not because they succeeded but because they tried, and in trying became something larger than the circumstances that held them.